Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be speaking about the Old Testament. Now, when we approach that topic, we have to remember that this was the Bible that was used by both Jesus and the apostles. They assumed that their readers were familiar with the scriptures. Yet we're not going to look at it only through their eyes. We're actually going to go back, and if it's possible, we're going to step our feet into the sandals of the original writers, the original readers, and we're going to try to see it through their eyes, then also through the eyes of the New Testament writers, and then finally we're going to see how we can apply those teachings in our lives today. The first place that we ought to start is asking the question, what is the Bible? That could be answered in a variety of questions. We can think of the Bible in terms of the 39 books of the Old Testament and the 27 books of the New Testament, and yet they are a unified whole. The word Bible itself actually comes from a Greek word meaning scroll or book. They didn't have books in those very early days when the word was coined, so they would think of it more in terms of a unified group of writings, and that's exactly what the Bible is. Even though it's made up of many different books, there is a unity to them that we. I suppose we ought to ask how we know the right books are in the Bible. Quite a number of years ago, National Geographic magazine came out with an article relating the Gospel of Judas. It wasn't a brand new discovery. It was something that had been discovered back in Coptic Egypt in certain Gnostic writings many years ago. And it was not written at the same time as the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. It had been written quite a number of years later, a whole series of generations later. So it didn't have nearly the same weight and was not looked upon by the Apostolic Fathers or the Church Fathers as having the same sort of authority. And yet the question is still there. How do we know that Judas or other books like it shouldn't be a part of our scriptures? In the same way, the Apocrypha, those series of books that are located in the Roman Catholic Bible, and they like to refer to them as the Deuterocanonical writings. These additional books were written not after the New Testament, but actually after the close of the Old Testament and yet before the period of the New Testament. And the books they're in, especially I think of the book of Maccabees, are not all that bad. They do quite a good job of describing the history of that period between the end of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New Testament. And what's more, the New Testament writers assume that you are familiar with that period of history. So I think it's good for us to read those books, even though I do not consider them to be inspired by God. I do not consider them as a part of the Word of God. Yet at the same time, they're good and valuable, just as it would be good and valuable to read a historical background of the Old or New Testament. And they certainly provide the background of that intertestamental period, that period after the end of the Old Testament, but before the beginning of the New Testament period. We'll actually be referring to the Apocrypha later on in our class, and especially the books of 1st and 2nd Maccabees. This brings us then to the question of a term called canonicity. Canonicity refers to the church's recognition, and that's an important phrase, not just the church's seeing the authority of the inspired writings. Canonicity does not make a book inspired, but rather canonicity refers to the church's recognition of that authority, of the authority of the inspired writings. It looks at those books and it recognizes these are the books that the Holy Spirit was bringing about in an inspired way. In that question of canonicity, we have one helpful, especially of the Old Testament, we have one helpful testimony, and that is in the person of Josephus. Josephus was a writer in the New Testament era, actually after the close of the New Testament era. He's writing after the 70 AD fall of the city of Jerusalem. And in his book, Contra Appian, he's actually writing as a rebuttal to somebody named Appian who had said some rather nasty things about Jews and what they believe. in the context of that, he says, "For we have not an innumerable multitude of books among us, disagreeing from one and contradicting one another, as the Greeks have, but only 22 books." Now you say, wait a minute, John, the Old Testament has not 22, but 39 books. Well, that's okay, because Josephus counted the books a bit differently than the way that we count them. They are exactly the same books. But, for example, he looked at what we call the minor prophets, and he referred to that as a single unified writing called the 12. In the same way, he looked at books like 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles. He counted those as one book. And then Ezra and Nehemiah, even though they are two separate books under two headings, he counted that as one book. So when he speaks of the 22 books, he's speaking of our Old Testament arranged slightly differently, but exactly the same books. So he says, I'm picking up here, he says that they had only 22 books, which contain the records of all the past times, which are justly believed to be divine. He goes on to say, "It is true our history has been written since Artaxerxes," that is, the Persian king who was reigning, who was alive at the time when the books of 1st and 2nd Chronicles and Malachi were completed. He goes on to say, "Our history has been written since Artaxerxes very peculiarly, but has not been esteemed of the like authority with the former by our forefathers, because there has not been an exact succession of prophets since that time." What Josephus says is that there were prophets back during the time of the writing of the Old Testament. And then there came a time when there were no more prophets, when the prophets and their prophecies ceased, and as a result, the scriptures ceased. And so God stopped giving prophets and subsequently stopped giving prophetic writings. That is, he stopped giving the scriptures. So that our English Old Testament is composed then of what we in English call the Pentateuch, that is the first 5 writings, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, the books that are attributed to Moses. Secondly, we have the historical books. These are the books going from Joshua all the way to Esther, and they tell the rest of the history, beginning with the death of Moses. That's how Joshua starts off. Moses has just died. And then going through the period of Judges, we have Ruth, 1st and 2nd Samuel, that speak to us of both the prophet and judge Samuel, but then gives rise to the kings of Israel, both Saul and David and Solomon. And that takes us into 1st and 2nd Kings, where we read of both Solomon's reign and then the divided kingdom, as the kingdom splits between north and south. And then 1st and 2nd Chronicles will actually give us more of that story, repeating some of the same information that is in 1st and 2nd Kings, but actually going back all the way to Genesis in a sense, and giving us the genealogies, starting all the way with the creation of Adam. Then we have the books Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther, all of which tell us the story of what took place after the Babylonian captivity and after Israel comes back into the land. In Esther's case, the camera doesn't change. It doesn't bring us back into the land, but it looks at the events that are happening in far-off Susa, that is the capital of Persia, far to the east. At that point, historically speaking, we're actually done with the Bible, and yet our Bible, our Old Testament, is not completed at that point. It continues, and it continues in the poetic books, that is, those books of Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon. And in these books, we have other considerations. We have wisdom literature, and yet we're going to see that each of these books, some more than others, contain various sorts of poetic language, and so they've been grouped together in our Bibles as poetic books. Finally, we have the prophets, the prophetic books, and in our English Bible, this begins with Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, Daniel, and then what the Jews call the 12, those minor prophets, Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. And at that point in our English Bible, our Old Testament is complete. The Hebrew Bible, if you go into a Hebrew bookstore or you were to look in a scroll of the Hebrew Bible, you would find the same books, but they are arranged in a different order with different groupings. Now, the first group is the same as our Pentateuch. It is the Torah, that just means the law or the instruction. And again, it's Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, exactly the same, exactly in the same format. But then the second grouping is a bit different. These are the prophets, and it's not the same prophets that we speak of, although it contains some of those, but this actually begins with Joshua again. Those books that we refer to, the historical books, they think of as part of the prophets. And so we go Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, and remember, they don't necessarily speak of first and second. That's a convenience that we use, and yet it's an old convenience, probably because the size of the scroll was such that it did not allow them to have all of that in one continuous scroll. And so in a scroll, you want to break it up into smaller segments. It might be just a bit easier. And then Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and as we noted, the 12. And all of those books that we refer to as the minor prophets. So the prophets, or the way you say that in Hebrew, the Navi'im, and that just means the prophets. The third category is that category that we refer to as the writings. The way you say that in Hebrew is the Ketuvim, and these take up those same poetic books that we talked about, but is not limited to them. You have Psalms and Proverbs and Job and Song of Solomon and Ruth and Lamentations. I put those in a bit of a different order because some of those books are going to be described as the megaloth, the scrolls that are used for special religious observances. And then also we have Esther and Daniel and that single book that's been sort of joined together, Ezra and Nehemiah, and finally Chronicles being the very last book in the Hebrew Bible, and that takes us to the end of the writing. Now, one of the questions that we ask then, now that we have seen what are the books that comprise our Old Testament, that was the question of canonicity, now we ask the question of textual criticism, and the question here is, can our copies of the Bible be trusted? After all, we've had that experience of writing down maybe notes or trying to write something word for word, and we look back at that completed thing that we have written and we say, oh no, I misspelled this word, or I unintentionally left out a word, or I thought it was one word and by mistake I changed it. Maybe it was just a slight change, but that question has been compounded because we do not have the original manuscript that was written by Moses or Joshua or any of the prophets. What we have is copies, and we don't just have copies, we have copies of copies of copies. So that if we imagine the original manuscript, and let's take Isaiah for example, and Isaiah would have written this very extensive book, and that at some later date there are copies made, and then there are subsequently copies of those copies, and even further copies of copies of copies, and so the list goes on. The generations of manuscripts goes down to many, many generations. And this question was asked early in the 20th century. Is it possible that our Bible has changed so much over those thousands of years that we have lost all sight of what was originally part of the scripture the way it was in the original manuscript? Up until 1947, our oldest Hebrew manuscript was about 1,000 years old, and that was far, far removed from the original text. And then something happened in 1947. Down by the shores of the Dead Sea, there are caves along there known as a community that we came to know as Qumran. And it was in these caves that a shepherd boy, actually he was a young man, he was searching for a lost goat. He thought maybe the goat had wandered into one of these many caves that are along the shores of the Dead Sea. And it was getting late in the day, and he didn't feel like climbing up into the cave and looking for the goat, so he took a rock and threw it up into the cave, and expecting maybe the sound bah and the scampering of a goat. And instead, he heard a crash of some broken pottery that his rock had just made an impact upon that, and a crash, tinkle, tinkle, and our famous goat must have made himself known and wandered off, and he sort of goes out of the story after this. But that led to some curiosity. What could be up there in the cave that would make a crash instead of a dull thud or the baaing of the goat? And so the next day, our shepherd friend came back with a friend, and they searched the cave, and they found some broken pottery. And inside this broken pottery were some ancient scrolls. Now, they had no way of knowing what was on them. They couldn't read the scrolls. They were written with a very ancient writing. We know today it was Hebrew. But they took these scrolls, and eventually they're going to look in a number of different caves. Archaeologists are going to come back, and they will see caves in places like, and this is cave 4 that we see that's right next to Qumran. This particular one is a man-made cave. But there are going to be scrolls that are found all throughout this region, and caves that are found all throughout these regions. These will be the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Isaiah scroll, that's what we're going to look at next, was one of the original finds, and these scrolls were more than 1,000 years older than any of the previous manuscripts. These scrolls were examined and compared when they finally came into the hands of archaeologists, and perhaps we'll get a chance to talk about how that took place. When they were compared with the scrolls that were already had, with the Hebrew manuscripts that were already in use 1,000 years later, it was found that they were very, very close to being the same. Yes, there were some slight differences, and it helped them to correct and say, gee, maybe over the process of time, a few of these little changes, and they were usually in the area of numbers or perhaps the way a word might be spelled. But largely, they were identical. So that for all intents and purposes, the Dead Sea Scrolls and the later texts that had been copied so many hundreds, even 1,000 years later, were virtually identical. So that we can trust these manuscripts. We can trust the Old Testament manuscripts. And the science that helps us with that was that science of textual criticism. Next question that we want to ask is that of hermeneutics, and this is the science of interpretation. Hermes was actually the name of one of the Greek gods. You know how you had Zeus and Ares and Aphrodite. Well, Hermes was the messenger god, and so this is the science of the message, or the science of interpreting the message. And hermeneutics asks several fundamental questions. Here are the fundamental questions in hermeneutics. First of all, we ask the question, what did it mean as we read any given passage, whether it's in Genesis or Exodus or Isaiah or Malachi? We ask the question, what did this manuscript mean? What did this book mean to the original characters of the narrative? That's if I'm reading a historical narrative like Genesis, I'm reading about Adam and Eve, or I'm reading about Abraham or Noah or Jacob or Joseph. And I ask the question, what did it mean to them as they're going through the story? Now, they can't turn to the back of the book. They can't read the end of Genesis. Abraham hadn't read that. It hadn't been written yet. And so they're actually living it out. And I ask, what does it mean? What do these events mean to them? But I don't stop there. I also ask, what does it mean to the author as he's writing of the event many years later? For example, in Genesis, even though I'm reading about the stories of Adam and Noah and Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, it's Moses, many hundreds of years later, that's writing this book. And he has a particular purpose, and has particular ideas in mind, and it's appropriate for me to ask, what does this mean to him and to his recipients? And so I also ask, what does it mean to the original recipients that he has in mind? He's writing this for a particular audience, and I ask that question as well. It's only after I've asked what did it mean to the original characters of the narrative, and what did it mean to the author, and what did it mean to the original recipients, then I can ask, what does it mean to us today and to the New Testament writers? Let's take the example of Adam and Eve as they're going through. They're actually being cast out of the garden, and we read that whole narrative in Genesis chapters 1, 2, and 3 of both the creation and then the fall and then the judgment. And we can sort of imagine what they're going through, but then we think of Moses as he's writing this, and Moses is writing to the Israelites who have just recently left Egypt. So there's a similarity, perhaps, in their minds, just as Adam and Eve were forced out of the garden. So they have been, can I call it this? They have been, now they wanted to leave, but so there are some differences, but they have been forced out of Egypt, out of the, can I call it the Garden of Egypt? Because the scriptures actually use that term. And just as Adam and Eve went out into the outer world, outside the garden, a place that perhaps wasn't quite so garden-like, so also the Israelites and Moses have left the Garden of Egypt to be out in the wilderness. And perhaps there's a bit of a way they can identify with Adam and Eve. And that perhaps would be in their mind, so that the story resounds with them in a way maybe it doesn't quite resound with us. And it helps us, I think, to see that commonality. So that now as we read our Bible in our 21st century, we can take it, we can apply it, but we can better apply it if first we look at it not just through the eyes of Adam and Eve, if that's the portion of the story that we're reading, but also through the eyes of Moses and through the eyes of the Israelites. And we might be able to see just a bit more in our reading. So we ask the question, yes, what does it mean to the original characters of the narrative? What does it mean to the author? What does it mean to the original recipients? And then we also ask, what does it mean in light of New Testament revelation? Because as we come to the New Testament, we have the advantage of perspective, and the New Testament writers will comment on those Old Testament events and allow us to see them a bit better.